And thank you very much. A reminder, coming up, we have several really interesting speakers and panel presentations. After we hear from Kellyanne Pidgeon, who's up next, we're going to have State Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill and State Representative Don Kiefer. They're going to be here to talk about unleashing the power of free enterprise. And then we have a very, very compelling segment on expanding educational opportunities. We have with us Corey DeAngelis from the Reason Foundation, and then we're going to have a panel with Otto Banks from the Reach Alliance. He will be moderating, and we have with us the Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education, Frank Brogan. State Senator John DeSanto will be here, along with Colleen Hondrick from the Commonwealth Foundation. And then later today, we have John Gizzi from Newsmax Magazine and Dr. Paul Kenger from Grove City College talking about the state of the conservative movement. But before we get to all of that, we are very pleased to have by video joining us Kellyanne Pidgeon. Kellyanne is the owner of Armed and Feminine. They are a company that specializes in firearms training for women. Her company has trained over 1,000 women in firearm safety and usage over the past few years. As you might imagine, she is a strong advocate of the Second Amendment. The Pennsylvania Leadership Conference is very pleased to welcome Kellyanne Pidgeon.
Hi, I'm Kelly Pidgeon, and welcome to the Second Amendment presentation. Most very active gun owners know the Second Amendment off by heart. I want to point out a few key features to that for this presentation. A well-regulated militia necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Key points: necessary for security. That's a really big point. And then also shall not be infringed. And anytime there's some type of anti-gun legislation, we get all riled up about shall not be infringed. And actually the Pennsylvania Constitution uses the words shall not be questioned. So with no infringements and no questions, we're still seeing this in our world today. Two things I want to talk about, two cases that are incredibly important for gun ownership in the Second Amendment. The first one was a milestone case in front of the Supreme Court called D.C. versus Heller. Dick Heller was the security guard, and for that job, he had to use a firearm, but he was not permitted, living in Washington, D.C., to have a firearm in his home, and so he felt that he should be allowed to. Long story short, the case went to the Supreme Court, and in a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court sided with Mr. Heller and said, boom, the 2A protects individual rights to own a gun. The other piece that is really important about this is it said, for the purpose of self-defense. Never before had any ruling mentioned self-defense in relation to the Second Amendment. Another piece that I think is very interesting about the Heller decision is SCOTUS came right out and said that no one can ban an entire class of arms that is, quote, commonly owned. So now when we're seeing all of this assault rifle ban, which is really just the modern sporting rifle, you know what, those are commonly owned. And for self-defense, millions and millions of people have modern sporting rifles. So under Heller, those very well may be protected. The next case is McDonald versus Chicago. On the heels of Heller, Mr. McDonald also felt that he too should be have the right to self-defense, and he wasn't permitted to have a gun in Chicago. Long story short, his case made it to the Supreme Court, and in a very narrow decision of 5-4, they ruled in his favor, which says the right to bear arms applies to state and local governments. And under the 14th Amendment, he had a right to his life, liberty, and property. And the 14th Amendment requires states and local governments to respect the Second Amendment. So even with these two landmark decisions, Heller and McDonald, we continue to still see legislatures around the country, different states, proposing anti-gun legislation, which is in direct violation of Heller and McDonald. Preemption. What does preemption mean, and why is it important? Well, basically what preemption says is that it prevents any towns and municipalities from enacting their own gun control laws. We are very, very fortunate in Pennsylvania that this is part of our Constitution. Not every state has preemption. It protects us. Preemption protects us. Could you imagine driving from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia and having to know and to obey different laws in every single municipality that you drove through? It would be crazy. So we are grateful to have that in our Pennsylvania Constitution. The whole movement to disarm America. Entrez vous, Mr. Bloomberg. You know, all of this whole gun sense stuff started with the onset of Sandy Hook, and everybody would agree that that is a great tragedy. And so out of that came a whole do something, and usually do something means to ban something. So Mr. Bloomberg actually pays millions and millions of dollars to his groups in every town for gun safety and Moms Demand Action. Look here on the slide, they get millions of dollars allocated to them every year for their budget. Essentially, too, what he's been doing of late, too, is buying elections and buying laws. If you look at the Moms Demand social media, this particular slide that I have up here will show you that they have disarm hate, but then they crossed out the hate, which shows you what they're really about, which is disarming America. Here are some more claims that they have, that they've won victory in all of these states, with their grassroots, and it really came down to money and a number of seats that were uncontested where they were able to, get the majority and get different laws passed. Let's look at the states' movements now. Not only in Pennsylvania, but in states across this country, we see a huge movement toward anti-gun legislation, most of which include bans or restrictions, red flag laws, safe storage laws, and transfer or sale prohibitions. Every gun owner is going to tell you that any law is an overreach of government. And honestly, not one gun law that's been in effect has been able to effectively stop violence. Let's take a look at Pennsylvania specifically, since that's what we're all about here today. In the 2019 to 2020 session, there have been 29 pieces of anti-gun legislation proposed. You will note as you go through, we're not going to look at every one of them, just a few of them. There's a resounding theme of who is sponsoring these. So let's just take a look at a few. House Bill 162. One purchase a month. That might seem reasonable to other people, but folks who have businesses in the gun industry, it's not really a reasonable option. House Bill 204, no toy or imitation firearms, a complete prohibition on any type of toy that looks or resembles a firearm. Waste of our time. 307, the assault weapons ban. I mentioned this already quickly. Bans the possession, purchase, or transfer of it. There's no such thing as an assault weapon for the everyday American. There's already a ban on that. They're talking about semi-automatic firearms, which is certainly not going to be the case. 336, a ban of firearms on the state capitol complex. Now, we already have a no-gun zone inside the state capitol. We understand that. But all the property around it. So if I were just there to visit with my family and take some selfies, I would not be able to have my firearm there to defend my life and my family's should something bad happen. So tell me why my life is important. I can defend it in my house, but not when I'm outside of my house visiting my state capitol. Doesn't make much sense. 467. You, as a gun owner, will need to now obtain a firearm eligibility license. This would be similar to the FOID card that they have in Illinois. So you would pass a background check, pay an enormous fee, which of course discriminates against poor people, that says, yes, this is my card that allows me to buy a gun. Well, when you go to buy a gun, you have to go through all of the background checks and legal hoops anyway to do it. This is just a ridiculous one. 525 and 532 revolves around safe storage. Pretty much most responsible gun owning Americans are going to have safe storage regardless. But if everyone needs to be locked up and I need that to protect myself, anything that is behind a lock is going to waste time and could cost me my life. 724, concealed carry permit training. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all about education. That's what I do. I'm a trainer and I'm an instructor. However, I don't think it should be something that is required. Once again, anytime there's money involved or time involved, this discriminates against the poor. If that's going to be the case, then we need to make it needs to be free, it needs to be available immediately, and transportation needs to be provided for folks who don't drive. People don't think about all the ramifications of these proposed bills when they do it. 738 ammunition purchases requires a photographic identification to buy ammo. We don't even need voter ID, but we're going to need it to buy ammunition. I'm not sure why looking at your face on your driver's license is going to make it okay to buy ammunition. Prohibition of realistic toys. So here again, you can't buy a toy that looks like a gun unless you're 18 years of age. 768 by Rep. Cruz. If you notice, Rep. Cruz has sponsored most of these anti-gun legislation pieces. A firearms registry. There you have it. He wants every firearm owner to register and be known at the state and what firearms you have. Well, it's right in the Pennsylvania Constitution that the Commonwealth will not create and or maintain a firearm registry. It's right in the Pennsylvania Constitution. So once again, another waste of our time. 1162, minimum age of 21 to purchase a semi-automatic firearm. Here we go again with terminology. People don't understand the term semi-automatic firearm. They think big, scary black rifle. Well, a semi-automatic firearm is just an action of how the gun operates. And so a Glock, a Smith & Wesson, most guns that many women carry for everyday safety is a semi-automatic firearm. So let's take a look at 21 years of age. Well, I could be 20 years old and have 2 children in my home, and I want to protect them and myself, but I can't buy a gun because I'm not 21? Doesn't make much sense when I can go to the military and risk my life, and I can vote and I can get married, all of those things at the age of 18. 1075, extreme risk protection orders, aka red flag laws. Red flag laws are dangerous. Actually, they're straight up gun confiscation, if you ask me. Anyone, anywhere can make an allegation against you or me and say, oh, I think she's a risk and she has guns. And we can, without due process, have sheriff's deputies come by and take all our guns away. And there are no penalties for people who lie about things like that. ERPOs can backfire on people. They're just very, very dangerous and zero due process. 2702, requiring a 72-hour waiting period to buy a gun. Once again, let me go back to a woman's scenario. I file a PFA against my domestic partner, and I have to wait 3 days to be able to buy a gun to protect myself. Look, we all know a PFA, although legally binding, it's just a piece of paper. It's not going to protect me. So now I have to wait for 72 hours to be able to protect myself from a crazy person who's now even angrier that I have filed a PFA. People don't think these proposals through. That's just a few of them. You can look at the rest of them there. So let's move on to common sense. The antis are all about common sense. Well, I use a few lines often when I'm out speaking. I'm like, common sense cannot be legislated. Like, you cannot legislate good parenting and you cannot legislate common sense. So this really doesn't come around to being about safety. What it really comes down to is control. And that's where we're not going to give in. So the other side loves to tout numbers. We like numbers too, but just the number of deaths by gun. Well, when we look at this, 2/3 of all of the gun deaths are suicides. When we want to look at what the real problem is, this is going back to mental health reform. So if you can look here on the screen, back in the 1950s, we still have no more guns per capita today than we had back in 1950. And you can look here, 4 times more likely somebody to be stabbed to death than shot to death by a rifle. So here's what we're up against, the tactics. When we look at the anti-side of guns or gun control, as conservatives, we're all about, look at the facts. These are the numbers. Here's what the data is telling us, or how we're interpreting the data. The other side is using emotions, screaming, crying, trigger words like gun violence. And I'm not really sure why gun violence is any different or worse than any other type of violence, like knife violence or hammer violence or baseball bat violence. It's all violence. Maybe we should be using the term gun crime. Gun sense, we talked about that. Never, ever, ever, ever do we see proposals about how we are going to disarm violent criminals. You know, I got to sit in a House Judiciary Committee meeting on the assault weapons ban, and we'll get to a slide of that later. And never at any point did somebody blame the person who was using a gun. It was always the gun was the problem, the gun was the problem. Gun just sits there. It's like having a broom in your house. It does nothing but sit in the corner until somebody picks it up and uses it. So until you can get violent criminals, get the guns out of their hands, all you're doing is handcuffing the law-abiding citizens with these silly gun control laws. So let's take a look at turning the tables. Whoa, how things have changed in the last few months. In the second quarter of 2020, we have welcomed 5 million new gun owners to our world. 5 million. So what was happening? I'm telling you, a lot of these folks were anti-gun. They're coming to me for training, and they've even said, I've never liked guns, I haven't approved of guns, but now I have one and you need to teach me how to use it. I will do that. Let's take a look at it. Rioting, unrest, defund the police. People aren't feeling safe in their homes anymore. And they're finally recognizing that they have this liberty called the Second Amendment, where they're permitted to go ahead and purchase guns to defend themselves. So we're hoping for a big gun vote this time. You know, the gun vote, I'm a single issue voter for many reasons. We're hoping to be able to sway those folks over rather than letting them stay on traditional party lines. So how do we win the debate with these folks? Well, we've got to find common ground and shared values. We want the same thing. We want everyone to be safe. We don't want schools to be shot up. We don't want crazy people to have guns. But we've got to have the conversation. At no point does anyone from the other side want to have the conversation with us. And actually use real statistics. If you go to crimeresearch.org, it's independent, real information, none of which is slanted, which is what we typically tend to see from the other side. So what are the solutions? Well, let's enforce the gun laws that we already have. There are 20,000, more than 20,000 gun laws on the books across this country. But we'll see people plead down, get out of jail, over and over. Let's just stay with where we are. Education and training. You know, we've seen teen pregnancy decrease over decades. Why? Education. It's the same thing about gun ownership. Let's get, hunter safety back in schools. Fix NICS, we could do an entire subject on that. That's the background check system. There are some flaws in it, and it could stand to have some upgrading. Mental health reform, we already talked about. 2/3 of all gun deaths are suicides. We need to talk about that and put some money where those problems are. And school protection programs. Just making a school a gun-free zone just sets them up to be prey. Let's protect our kids with real solutions in the school, with officers if we need to. But school protection programs will help. So what are we doing on the other side? Well, trying to fight fire with fire. So with all of the red shirts, we have teal shirts. So I am part of the DC project. I am Miss Pennsylvania, and we are a national effort, and at the state level, to organize women to meet with our representatives both in DC and at home to educate them about why firearm ownership is so important to women, because people really don't look at at women. They tend to have a profile of gun owners. Well, gun ownership has no profile. The 2A is for everyone. So these are some of the hashtags that we use. Education, not legislation, is our big one. And so many of the candidates are wanting the women's vote this year that we may have those voices now that we have so many new female gun owners. So how do we preserve the future of liberty? Well, succession planning is a big piece. I know in the primaries around Pittsburgh, there were many uncontested races. And that's how Virginia was lost as well, because there were empty seats in the Republican side. So how do we groom people to take places or to want to run for public office? Because it's a difficult job. Vote, of course, that's an easy one. The FOAC website, Firearm Owners Against Crime. They grade each of the candidates on their voting record. Not all R's are good and not all D's are bad, so they have really good information there. Local elections truly do matter. So in summary, I'm only going to point a few of these out. You can look at these here. Everyone is pro-gun. If something bad is happening, you either have a gun or you're calling somebody with a gun who's going to come and help you. I believe that being safe is better than feeling safe. The right of the people shall not be infringed. Gun vote, gun vote, gun vote, and succession planning is key. I'm Kelly Pidgeon. Thank you for watching. If you have any feedback or questions, feel free to contact me at armedandfeminine@gmail.com.